Welcome, everyone, to Successfully Managing a Website Firm or Consultant. I am Laura Quinn. I am a nonprofit website coach and guide. So that means that I work with nonprofits on web projects. And that includes a large amount of my projects are helping when there is another firm or consultant in the mix. I'm doing hourly weekly check-ins, for instance, to make sure that things are going according to plan and highlight risks and best practices. I'm also an editor of the nonprofit website Insider, which is a newsletter, which many of you probably saw in passing as you registered. And I am here with Brenna Jennings, which I'm very excited about. Brenna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Brenna Jennings. I am currently the senior digital person at ASPCA. I've been with them since 2009, and I manage primarily, oh, and I have to get you our new logo, Laura.
Ooh,
Um, I manage ASPCA Pro, which is, um, let's see, last year we had roughly 1.2 million visitors come who work in animal welfare, primarily shelter folks, some veterinarians, a handful of law enforcement, and then a little bit of animal control, which kind of falls under law enforcement. But we aim to help all of those people feel supported in doing their jobs, giving them ideas on how to streamline things. Shelters are struggling, and so we're really trying to get in there as an advocate and help for the work that they're doing, which is not getting any easier.
absolutely. Fantastic. Just to check, Brenna, I see your video. Do you see my video?
I do, and I see my big face on the screen.
Yes, yeah, on this lovely headshot of you. So Brenna is also a photographer, so she's got a good headshot. Great. Here's what we're going to talk about. We'll quickly talk about just so either before or during the project, the importance of kind of having a reasonable setup internally. Quickly finding a vendor. Then we'll talk a lot about establishing the project and ongoing management. And then most of these will apply to any kind of web project, but we'll talk about a couple of specific things. Like, so for instance, if you're looking at a branding project, or if you're looking at a metrics project or SEO type thing. All right, let's start with knowing thyself. So you want to make sure that you have a reasonable idea of what your own goals and audiences are. So a medium-sized or larger firm, and we'll talk about kind of sizes of firms and what they have to do with anything, will almost certainly work with you to try to understand these. But it's important for you to at least know a sense of your goals in order to start looking around for what you need. So, what are you trying to achieve? What does success look like? This is, I've have an example here of like just a little post-it board. This is a useful exercise to do online or in person with one of these post-it type things. Who are your audiences? Quickly think about what success might look like for each audience. Keep in mind that your audiences are probably not there for exactly the same things that you are hoping that they will do. So, trying to find that balance. Stakeholders. So, think through who it needs to be involved in the project and what their roles are. I really love this project. I really love this picture because this is not a stakeholder team. This is I mean, I guess it could be maybe an advisory board, but this is way too many people. We've also got this woman here who's like, what the hell is going on and why are we doing this? So it can't be everyone. We'll talk a little later about different roles and sizes. But you want to think about how you'll make decisions. And in particular, you want to think about, do you want a website firm that is going to help you wrangle your stakeholders? If that is an expectation that you have, then that's going to be important to keep in mind as you look for one, because not every firm is going to be they won't assume that they'll do that, and not everyone will have really experience there. Brenda, you want to talk a little bit about what stakeholders look like for your team?
Yes, we're very invested. We are extremely collaborative. And so I have definitely leaned on, and our last big web project was in 2017 with a fantastic vendor. I I don't know at the time that I consciously knew this, but what I did look to them for and then figured out like, oh, they're really great at that was bringing the people who we knew would want to have a voice in this process in at the right times and then kind of giving them the satisfaction and the input that was valid and legitimate, but then also knowing how to set them in a different role for the pieces where their feedback may have held things up or wouldn't be necessary or was too in the weeds of what we were doing. So there's that. And then I would say, as much as whoever, an internal meaning at the organization that's undertaking this web project, whoever their project manager or the person acting as the overseer of the project is, to try to resolve any internal politics before, so that you're not using your vendor's time to navigate those relationships or those difficulties. And an example in our organization is we have multiple departments in the same discipline. So we have multiple departments who do behavior work, and sometimes they don't align. And what I wouldn't want to do is be progressing through a web project and expecting a vendor to help those two groups come to agreements on pieces of content or navigational things or philosophies that we're going to push out to a public audience, and try to get that handled in-house. And I would encourage the vendor to kind of push that if they start seeing it. Say, we want to be very engaged in this part of the process, but it seems like it might be better if this gets handled before you spend your time and money on us on a relationship versus on the work and the strategy that has to get done here.
Fabulous. Great. And the opposite of what Brenna is describing in terms of a web consulting firm getting involved in kind of who is involved at each step is that they would simply have the expectation that you know the right people for each meeting, and that you will they'll basically say, all right, at this date, you'll need to provide us complete feedback from all your stakeholders. So it basically, that's the opposite of what Brenna just described. Great. You want to see if you can determine the budget range, at least on a general sense. This is really important because if you're going to if you're going to put out an RFP or an RFI, and I'm going to talk about RFIs in just a second, what that even is. It's very important to put a budget range in it, because if you have in your head that you've got $25,000 for this, or $5,000, or $100,000, those imply very different websites to people who know what websites are, and you'll get different people applying for them. So you'll have different people submitting responses. You will get people saying, here's what I can build for $5,000. But somebody who's expecting, it doesn't make any sense for you to get a bid on your project, your $5,000 project, for $50,000. It's just a waste of everybody's time. So here's how to think about your budget range. So talk to other people who have done similar projects. You want to decide how much you can do in-house compared to what you're expecting, and we'll talk about some of the roles. We're going to talk on the next slide about, is it a solo person, a one person? Is it a small firm? Is it a big firm? That can make, in fact, in my experience, one of the biggest differences in the price. You're never going to find a big firm that was willing to work at $5,000 for basically any project. It's not worth, doing anything because they have a bunch of overhead costs, all of that stuff. For $5,000, you're almost certainly going to be working with a single consultant, possibly somebody who's partnered with somebody else, kind of more of a Jack or Jill of all trades. So here are some budgets just for to get a sense. So 5 to 10, very simple site by a freelancer, small firm, effective kind of marketing site, not super complicated, 25,000, bit more complexity, larger firm, 50,000, more complexity or a marketing site from a top firm. And then you can be spending $200,000 or more for a complex site. So here's individuals versus small firms versus big firms. So solo consultants are almost always the cheapest option. So if you are looking for cheap, then going with, so even if you have project management experience in-house, you could think about a solo, for instance, uh, person to design, like a UX designer, someone to design how the website works, then a solo graphic designer, and then a solo website development person. That's going to be a big pain for you to manage. And one of the things you get with a small firm or a large firm is you get all of those people with different skills managed by somebody else other than you. So solo consultants are almost always the cheapest option, but they tend to be skilled only at specific things. Logically, no one is skilled in everything, and all the parts of a website is a lot of things. So if you're expecting a really polished, professional website, there's probably some individuals who could do all parts of that, but they're probably going to be hard to find because some of them are going to be great at kind of doing the experience, but they won't be great at the website development or vice versa. And the big downside is there's no backup if something happens to them. So if you're working with, Laura Quinn on all parts of your website, which you wouldn't be because I don't do all parts of your website. But if you were, and I decide to go move to Tahiti, then there's no backup. Then you're kind of just on your own. Small
And I
firm.
would say,
Sorry.
oh, sorry, Laura. I
Yeah,
was
please
just
do.
going to say, in the realm of complexity versus simplicity, an organization might not know what complexity looks like because if you see something on the web all the time, you may not know what the back end of that entails. So I think a vendor who might give an initial consult could help you understand, oh, this thing you're looking for is actually quite a bit of work because it has to be built in a certain way. And then I would also, I guess this kind of goes along to what the vendor can help manage for people who may not be as familiar with how websites are structured. They should be able to guide you in saying, I know you think you need that gadget or that bell and whistle or that user account creation ability that's collecting all kinds of data. But what's your goal with it? What are you going to do with it? Do you really need it, or can we simplify this a little bit further and save you some money in your time and development expenses?
Yep, absolutely. And that I think is really going to the skills of a large firm typically. So a large firm, so this is kind of useful to see as a spectrum. You can depend on a large firm typically to have a deep bench of skills and to do all the parts that I or Brenna would expect from a project. Um, so, and they have experience working with lots of stakeholders on complicated projects, skilled project management, all of the things. Small firms, you need to be a little more careful with, okay, what are they? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Do they actually have strength in what Brenna just said, in talking through with you as to what your website should do, to define out how it's going to work? Or do they simply turn to you and say, all right, so what do you want? What's going to happen with this website thing? That is a skill that some firms bring and some don't. Other things are whether they'll help with like overall messaging and branding, whether they'll help with whether they'll have polished, really polished graphic design, or graphic design may not be a huge strength. Whether they're really solid in not just creating a website, but QA for the website, so quality assurance for the website and testing. So if you're working with a smaller firm, you need to look a little more into, okay, where are their strengths and weaknesses? Because there probably are some strengths and weaknesses. Yes, and Brenna's mentioning absolutely to itemize what your people can skillfully, importantly, do in-house, to think through what you need your vendor to be able to do. All right, so Lou asks, what about big firms giving you their junior people? So basically, so I can interpret that two different ways. So is there an issue that if you're working with a large firm, you're a small fish in a big pond, that you're not a high priority and you get their junior people? I have not really experienced that. There are junior people. So if you look at people, if you look at firms who specialize in the nonprofit space, simply because they don't get that big. So you typically have, in that case, you have more senior people overseeing the project and more junior people looking at it. I could also interpret this question as, can I ask a large firm to give me junior people to work on my project? And the answer is most typically going to be no, at least not without paying a pretty high rate, a much higher rate than a solo a solo consultant, simply because they need to protect themselves against, you are working with the large firm, even though it's a junior person, they need to oversee that person's work for the reputation. Yeah, and Virginia is saying it had a big firm doing pro bono work and you get what you pay for, implying that just because it's a large firm doesn't mean, especially if you're not paying for it, that it is necessarily high quality. Finding a vendor. So, how do you find one? So, if you have a firm you like, don't feel like you need to look around. Nothing drives me insane like people putting out an RFP when it's already everybody knows what firm they're going to choose. That is just a waste of absolutely everybody's time and the time of the sector in general. It drives the price of websites up for everybody. Um, Asking partner orgs for recommendations can be a good way to build a short list, or thinking about an RFI process. So, what is an RFI process? So, basically, sending out a document that briefly describes the project. I have actually a template for this, which I'm going to put into the chat. Um, Gather answers, so short answers that briefly describe, that allow vendors. By the way, website consulting firms really don't like to be called vendors. Nonprofits use term vendors a lot, so I am kind of alternating between the two. You'll find if you call them vendors to their face, they'll tell you they're not a vendor, they're a partner. So and many of them are partners. Potentially gather answers, quick answers through a form to easy questions. So, not specifically about your project, but about their experience and examples of their work. So, for instance, this was one for a project for which we were thinking our project was about in the $100,000 range. We asked people, okay, what approximate percentage of your projects are in this range? We also asked what were smaller and what were larger to try to get a sense as to which they did. Um, WordPress, substantial online resource libraries, whoops, sorry, um, integrated software, supporting constituents emailing their representative. We also asked for 3 example sites. 3 example sites can be a fabulous way to evaluate firms because if you say, here's approximately what our website is going to be, please send us your best 3 examples as to things you've built that are like this. You can then evaluate, okay, are these anything like what we're planning to do? Because that's the closest they have, probably. And what do we think of these sites that they've built? So then you narrow down the list for either a detailed RFP. So you basically then say, all right, we're going to pick our top 6 or 8 or 10 to get a price and detailed answers, or simply phone conversations. So you might say, oh, we only really have a top 4. We're going to skip straight to phone conversations. And obviously, there will be discussion of price and scope of work and things like that, which I'm going to talk about in the next section. An RFI process gets you much better candidates than sending out an RFP initially. So it's easier, I find, for you, for nonprofits, and it will get a lot of responses from people who otherwise won't respond. So busy firms that have lots of work do not respond to RFPs in general because they're busy doing a lot of high quality work and working by word of mouth. But if it only takes them half an hour and it's an interesting project, then they may well submit an RFI. So great. And also those firms are more likely to be, so smaller firms run by women or traditional minority communities, so it's kind of better for everybody, much more equity focused. All right, questions about finding a vendor before we move into establishing the project? So as you look at what the scope of work is and how the project will be run, make sure that you define not just the outcome, but the deliverables are on the way. So not you make a contract for logo and visual branding, and then some kind of magic occurs in the middle, but specifically what's going to happen. So there's going to be research, and approximately with this many people, and there's going to be a presentation of the finding. There's going to be a brief. By the way, this is not the only deliverables you could do. This is actually a very large process for a logo and visual branding. This is in fact probably a $30,000 to $50,000 project for logo and visual branding, and you could do it for less than that with a lot less than these deliverables. But this is one of the things that you'll get at a higher price. So if you're wondering what the difference between a $5,000 logo and visual branding and a $50,000 logo and visual branding, some of it is that there's a lot of interim work. It is also valid for the firm to say, okay, I can't give you exactly what we think our process should be until we work together a little bit. So they might say, okay, there's an upfront discovery phase, particularly if you have a complicated project or kind of a website that is a little different than things that are typically done. They may say, all right, let's work together to understand it better, and then we can give you exactly what we think our process should be. You want to think about iterations. Iterations are very important for things, for a lot of the parts of a website. So graphic designs for the definition of um, what the user experience will be, like how pathways through the site work. So each time the firm provides a draft and then revises it, that's an iteration. So you'll hear a lot about, in like, for instance, a contract, um, and it's a good idea to have in the contract that this is assumed to be two iterations. Um, and more iterations are expensive. So you can, for instance, say, for instance, what if there is only one iteration? So we provide a set of comments. There's only iteration once. It is finalized. That's a little dangerous. Two is kind of the standard. Three, sometimes if you know that you're going to have a lot of, opinions and stakeholders. Um, Not many firms are going to cut you off cold turkey if you ask for changes after, an iteration two. But if you consistently ask for more iterations, the firm may start to talk about scope changes. And as Steve had mentioned, change orders. This is the type of thing that they might say, all right, we've been doing a lot of iterations on a lot of things. If this is important, to continue working on this set of graphic designs, we're going to ask you for an additional $1,000, and that'll be a change order that'll be negotiated between you.
Laura, I haven't encountered this, but um, nope, the word is escaping me. What can an org do if their partner, their agency that they're working with, is truly missing the mark on some of these
Ah,
things?
So that's actually a key point where friction can occur. Because logically, one can say, all right, yeah, it was two iterations, but I expected your iterations to be decent, that to not be, I mean, obviously you would never say this, but I did not expect them to be crappy. So I think it's important to say at the first revision, if they've truly missed the mark, to say, okay, here are the ways you've missed the mark, and here's why I expected you to know this. So, as we talked about, our priorities are X, Y, and Z. We, need to use this set of branding guidelines, which I gave to you. So, to kind of make it clear that you feel that they've missed the mark. So, this is part of, and we're going to talk about just kind of clear communication. Yeah, Brenna mentioned recourse. So I think that you want to be clear that you feel that you're not just giving feedback for a first iteration, that you feel they've missed the mark. You didn't do what you asked them to do to begin with, because then essentially the iteration doesn't start until they've provided a sufficient um, either first draft or iteration. Like also if they've done iteration one and they didn't actually address your comments in a sufficient way. Thank you. Great question. All right, I'm going to so you'll get these slides so you can look at this complicated chart at your leisure. So I'm just going to gloss over it for time. But you want to think about what kind of contract you're doing. Are you doing a flat fee or an hourly contract? There are pros and cons of both. I feel like a lot of people think that a flat fee is simply better. I feel like hourly can be better for complex things where there's going to be a lot of input from you, where it's harder for everybody to know how much time. And you want to think about whether you've got a specific end product or it's ongoing, like you're hiring someone to manage your social media. And so you could just do that hourly as needed, or you could do that on a retainer basis. These are the things you want to look for. So in this matrix, um, for these kind of contracts. And you want to think through how payment is made. Um, so in general, if you have a specific end product, you should always tie payments to deliverables. Even if it's hourly, you should tie the payments to the delivery of something, because otherwise it's too easy to just rack up costs and costs and costs without actually delivering anything. Otherwise, a retainer means that it's a monthly flat cost, while a ongoing hourly is just an hourly paid at the end of the month. All right, so I went through that too quickly to necessarily understand all of those things, but you can study those charts. We've talked a little bit about roles. Here's more about roles. Roles are very important. So Brenna mentioned the key contact for the firm. So this is, and it's probably simply the key project team leader for your organization. You've got some person who is in charge of this project moving forward. They are interacting with a project manager at the website firm. Or these might all be one person if you have an individual consultant there, so there's different roles. It is very useful to have a core team supporting the person. Even if you're tiny, having more people is really helpful. Otherwise, all the decisions are on you, and everything it kind of feels like, all right, this is my opinion. It's hard to know. Or you have someone very opinionated, and you kind of drive the website in a weird direction just because that's their opinion. You want to make sure that you have enough leadership sponsorship to get around problems, especially if you have like internal stakeholders that aren't part of the core team that don't fit into, like, you could, for instance, have a core team that represents whole departments, but maybe you've got someone like, for instance, an executive director who has opinions but can't come to team meetings. And you can't just say, all right, you need to go through channels. So then you've kind of got someone outside the process that you need to manage. Um, so you want a leadership sponsor who has enough sway to be able to wrangle people who aren't doing what you would hope they would do. Um, just very quickly, at the website firm, you're likely working with somebody who is in charge of managing the project, whether they are called a project manager or not. You want to make sure that you have somebody beyond, I mean, if there is anybody else in the firm, somebody who you can escalate concerns. So this might be an account manager or a partner. So to be able to say, I'm unhappy with what's going on when I talk to, Steve. Marta, I would like a one-on-one to discuss, what we can do better to work together. Um, and then there's probably, at even a small firm, lots of specialists. And you may be working a lot directly with them, or a lot of stuff might be filtered through a project manager. The project manager may act kind of as like a wall over which things are thrown. And that's kind of a style thing for the firm. Brenna, do you want to talk about kind of what a leadership sponsor means to you for the A?
Yeah, so currently, I'm going to say in our current and past big projects like this, our leadership sponsor has been the person who you can rely on to bring along anyone who needs convincing that's maybe at a higher level, or to keep those people informed, or to help those people feel like their opinions are being heard and incorporated, even if sometimes I don't want to say they're not, but they may not be the path that we end up taking. So the leadership sponsor for us tends to be the liaison that keeps the higher level folks who may be stakeholders but wouldn't be on a core team, wouldn't be immediately involved, informed of what's going on, helps them feel engaged with the project, and kind of maintains their buy-in on the
Mhm.
project by navigating that relationship.
Great, thank you. All right, a bit about check-in meetings. So it's important to have a regular check-in meeting every week or every 2 weeks, and make sure that it might not be just about the status of the project, but you want to make sure the status is addressed, and to make sure you're aligned on who needs to do what. This includes, in general, I think every status meeting should include, wow, thank you so much for the work you're doing. We love the graphic designs, or, as you know, we're a little concerned about where we are. We're a little behind schedule, but we're hoping, we can catch up. Just to reiterate, hopefully, things you've already told them, or to bring up new things that you are newly concerned. So it is clear, it's definitely and importantly part of every check-in to say what to use words to say what's in your head. In fact, a lot of the problems I've seen crop up on projects that I've been involved in is because problems have been left to fester for far too long. That a organization has not said they're concerned about X, and in fact, and it was a problem, but the consulting firm didn't have any chance to address it until way too long because they weren't aware that it was a problem. So, um, talk about if you're happy or not. If it's a flat fee project, you want to use the scope and the list of deliverables as a checklist and check off where things are. So you want to understand where things are, and you want to understand whether the firm feels like they're on track to, on the project to get it on time, on budget for them. On budget for them is a little interesting because it's a flat fee project. So in theory, I mean, so if they come in under budget, great, whatever, they get to just keep the money. But if they are burning money on your project, then they're much more likely down the road to start to push back. To start to possibly find reasons to do change orders. So it's really important to know as early as you can if they feel that they are really spending more time than they really wanted to, because you want to team up with them to find things to drop or not do, as opposed to just forcing them at the end of the project to, some of them will eat a lot of money, but many will not. And so basically, instead, it will come in the form of change orders that you didn't expect, or like, oh, you think we should fix this bug? Oh, that'll be extra money. So just kind of things that seem a little unexpected. If it's an hourly project, you want to get estimated hours for each deliverable from the vendor, and you want to check in their actual hours. So this is called a burn down. So if you've got a professional project manager, you can ask for the burn down. So you basically should be able to know at the end of, like, graphic design, for instance, whether you are on track based on where they expect it to be. That's certainly, at least any big firm will be able to tell you that. You might get some hesitation from other people, but they should be able to figure it out. I'm just going to gloss over this one. You want to be a human. So specific things that will start to drive your firm nuts, being unpredictable. changing your mind, being consistently late, criticizing the quality rather than the content of the deliverables. So logically, you could have quality issues, but you want to bring that up in a very specific way. Um, you know, Talking to anyone of any level like they're a minion rather than a partner. Um, I mean, obviously they're under contract and they will do their best. Um, but firms will absolutely go the extra mile for clients who are a joy and are obviously doing the very best they can. And they will carefully track and push back on ones that aren't. Um, Winifred asks, you mean they'll charge extra for bugs they made? I actually have a whole slide that I didn't put in this, but maybe I'll actually include it in the deck I sent out. On the problem is that many larger sites have many things that are potentially not ideal and deciding what is a bug in quotes. So a bug in quotes actually means that it is not to spec, that it is very clear that it shouldn't be that way, and in fact, it went wrong. But you may think that there are issues, maybe even really important issues, that were not defined. And Brenna's putting an example in there. And in fact, this would be a great place if one of my website consulting friends who are on the line could put a example here of the type of bug that the types of bugs that might not be fixed as you get to the end of the project. You often launch with a bunch of bugs and issues. All right, I have 1 minute left. I should not have said this was a four. Actually, I'm gonna raise your hand if you would like me to go to the hour as opposed to winding this up in 45 minutes, even though I said it was an hour long. There is a way to raise your hand, you go to, even I can't find it. Okay, so we have some. Raise your hand if you want me to do a grand wrap up in a couple minutes. Okay, I got no hands for that. So, for those of you who have to jump, obviously I understand that because I actually promised this was going to be 45 minutes. I went awry. I've actually never done that before. And this turns out not to be possible. So, great. We're going to go to the hour. Graphic design feedback. Um, this tends to be really tricky um, because Brenna, your stuff has been really useful. So yeah, it's been one of them. It's like I don't want to cut off Brenna's really useful feedback. Um, I feel like many of us, I am not a graphic designer, but many of us look at a graphic design and have feelings about it. And sometimes those feelings are like, wow, look how bright this yellow is compared to this blue. Or like, is this little house thing the right icon? And we need to make sure that we focus on not whether we find the graphic designs pleasant, fun, well, fun might be actually one of the brand attributes, but whether they're polished and credible, they prioritize information effectively, they make any calls to action clear, they present the attributes of the brand. So I could absolutely call out, is this home icon, is this actually clear enough? I mean, to me, it obviously is clear enough. But saying I don't like this color yellow, unless it's against the brand guidelines, that is not helpful feedback. I might say, is this um uh does this have enough contrast? Will people notice this button enough? Or in fact, is this button too bold? Is this all anybody's going to see? when they look at it. So you want to make sure that you're respecting your graphic designer to actually do graphic design, and what feedback you're giving them is what is not solutions oriented. Hey, why don't you move this over here? But is based on what doesn't work according to kind of these guidelines. All right. Brenna, thoughts as to kind of when you're in the midst of a project, things that you want to think about or keep up on for to kind of avoid running into things, or things that would be a red flag to you as you work with somebody.
I mean, a lot of it is your gut. I have worked with a vendor who I constantly was getting the feeling couldn't stand us. And this was multiple migrations ago. And on launch, we had what we spoke about earlier, just glitches left and right. And some of them, I believe, were just the result of how these things go. You can't look at every single element. Uh, and they were really unhelpful, and they were really slow to respond to things, and really not willing to give me, and it was my first Drupal site ever, the guidance I needed to resolve things on my own. So I would say, like, you'll get vibes. Some of it is honestly vibes. And then other parts of it are, response time. What is the tone in meetings? What kinds of documentation are you getting? I feel like they'll become apparent over the course of a project if there's some stuff. And I would say address them as soon as possible. And if you're not comfortable addressing them, have somebody in that leadership position
Yep.
address the
Yep.
person at the partner vendor.
And if what you're feeling is vibes, it's hard to flag vibes. But
Yes.
what you can do is you can be more rigorous in your status meetings to make sure that um, in fact everything is going the way it should, and to be prepared potentially for more, go around at the end. And so the end around the launch of a project tends to be a somewhat more um, tricky navigational time as everybody tries to decide what is. So I just put another example of things that you might decide not to fix. As
Hmm.
everybody tries to figure out how to get it launch ready and what might actually not be fixed in
Right.
order to move forward.
Yep. And if you're new to the process, I mean, you kind of have to treat it like going to therapy. Like they have seen worse than you, and they have seen better than you. So don't go in thinking like, oh, my organization is so chaotic. We're going to drive them crazy. It's no wonder they're being chilly and they're not responsive to us. Don't. They've had worse than you.
Yes,
So you can expect open communicate, but you can expect that they've dealt with that and should know how to navigate it.
yes, yes, certainly at least to tell you, to a direct question. So if you ask them, are you finding it hard to deal with kind of our three people giving, the project manager input? They should certainly answer that question. They may or may not. So a big firm with a really solid project manager certainly could deal with that and many other things. I wouldn't trust any, like a solo consultant or a small firm to necessarily have great project management. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. But fostering the open communication by saying, I'm feeling like this is, like our meetings aren't as, kind of collaborative as I'd like them to be. Are we causing problems for you in some way? So anyway, uh, just a couple of things that you might think about. So, so as you are approaching specific kinds of projects, branding. So branding is high level positioning and or visual design and or logo. Um, so make sure you know precisely what is included, and which includes how the vendor will get feedback from your stakeholders. There's a lot of possibilities here. We actually looked at this early in kind of the possible deliverables under this. This could be like an almost like, boom, here's a logo. What do you think? Or it could be this vast process of uh, input from audiences through stakeholders through lots of stuff. And you want to make sure that you get clear documentation so you can continue to use the style that they've recommended. One of the key things about websites is you want to make sure that there is an official documentation of the scope. And this is confusing because there's a scope of work for the project itself. But probably well after that contract is signed, there is additional definition of the features, the pages, and the amount of work that's going to need to go into the site. So this might be captured in the form of a sitemap, for instance, for especially a small site. So this is a sitemap. So basically, just to see what pages there are, possibly with diagrams to map more complex functionality. Um, Requirement spreadsheets. So if you have a lot of functionality on your site that goes beyond just pages and page content, that could be used to measure scope. Um, Wireframes. So wireframes is a mock-up of a page so this would be more detailed than a sitemap. So some firms might go all the way through the process of wireframes in order to really understand the details of what's in your site, and things might be in flux all the way through that point. You want to make sure you stop at one of the, so you want to make sure that you have an understanding from your vendor when you will, and possibly it's multiple of these points, that we're going to look at a sitemap and we're going to make sure that it fits into the established scope. Then we're going to do wireframes, and we're going to make sure we're going to build that working together to make sure that fits into the established scope. That's the typical way to do this, is you work somewhat backwards once you have the scope of work to make sure things fit. But that does involve you thinking about, so you may come up with great things that you'd love to have, and they may say, I'm sorry, that does not, yeah, you may need to work with your firm to prioritize things to stay within the budget that was initially there. Brenna, do you have an example of some prioritization that you needed to do in order to, that was kind of well into the project to stay within the scope of the project?
Yes, I believe that once we got into determining the architecture and nav structure, we had to scale back the content categories that we had. And we had to take that on. Like we were like, okay, we can't have them spend the time doing this. We need to bring this into our own team and kind of lop off some of these things that we're seeing through user testing are not performing and not try to build this thing out further than we expected to.
Yeah. So there's two things there. There is, so basically deciding to, okay, we're not going to add a whole bunch of content, which is some work for a web firm, but not a ton. But there's also the idea that Brenna just said, all right, we brought it back in-house. So we said, all right, we were spending a lot of time working with the firm to try to figure out what to lop off. So we said, all right, we'll take this on. We'll say that that isn't part of what you do, so you have more time to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
All right, in our last 4 minutes, great time to ask questions. I'm gonna answer Steve's initial thoughts about thinking about change orders, and how they impact a project. Um, So change orders. So some, the reason he may be asking the question is I find that some firms use them as like a stick to like beat you over the head with. That like anything you say, they're like, great, yes, we could do a change order for that. And that's not really what you need. So a change order used correctly should be after you're working together to try to get the to try to achieve a site that is within scope. Both of you together decide that you want something that isn't within scope, and therefore you work together to do a change order, which means literally it's like a contract edition. So you say, all right, for another $2,000, we're going to do XYZQ in addition. Um, so if your web partner is beating you over the head with threats of change orders, which I have experienced, I think the way to push back on that is basically every time they say, great, we can do a change order for that, is to say, all right, well, we'd really like to stay within our scope. What would you recommend to get to the goals XYZQ that will be within scope to try to that it implies a vendor that is, and I've definitely worked with them, who is kind of expecting you to tell them what to build and to try to get them to partner a little more on that process, especially if you're trying and they're just saying, all right, that's a change order. Um, Fantastic. I'm seeing lots of thank yous. Thank you to you. Brenna, if you would have just one thing to wrap up here. Actually, I would love for everybody if they're willing. So just before you jump off, just one key thought that you got from this. One thing you're taking away. And Brenna, if you could do that out loud, kind of one thing that you would encourage people to, if they don't do anything else, to think about.
You said something earlier about being human in these relationships, and I think that's correct. I think everybody in these situations, it gets very formal and it needs to be very structured, but the human part of the interactions is pretty important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, I would echo that. I would say, so Steve says communication. Yes. So basically, to say what it is you are feeling about the project, is, I would say, the one thing that I see probably the most systematically go wrong, that someone didn't actually know. Um, Fabulous. Great. Thank you all so much for your time. I will get out a recording of this and the slides into your inbox. And certainly, I'd love if you sign up for the newsletter if you haven't yet. Hope to see you at another seminar soon.